Okay, so I was able to find a 1906 translation of 1906 version of Capital in a old bookstore. We're jumping into chapter 27, which is, I think, probably the most important chapter. A lot of the other information Marx uh, found was either well absorbed into the current system, has become common knowledge, or alternatively has been challenged, right? Kind of some of it's even come out to be pretty nonsensical. But we get into chapter 27 and beyond, and there's some important historical work that's really interesting. This translation was done by Samuel Moore. I think it was translated based on the earlier translation by Edward Aveling. But Samuel Moore was a friend of Marx and Engels, and this was the version in English that uses a lot of Engels notes. Okay. So chapter 27, the expropriation of the agricultural population from the land. In England, serfdom had practically disappeared in the last part of the 14th century. The immense majority of the population consisted then, and to a still larger extent in the 15th century, of free peasant proprietors. Whatever that was, the feudal title under which their right to property was hidden. Okay, so free peasant proprietors. This is different than being a serf with no rights and no power, completely under your local baron or duke or whatever. You have some rights as a free peasant proprietor. And the structure of the system actually was much more just than what followed, right? The removal of those free peasant proprietors from their freedom and their land. Continuing on. In the larger seigneurial domains, the old bailiff, himself a serf, was displaced by the free farmer. The wage laborers of agriculture consisted partly of peasants who utilized their leisure time by working on large estates, partly of an independent special class of wage laborers, relatively and absolutely few in numbers. The later were practically at the same time peasant farmers, since, besides their wages, they had allotted to them arable land to the extent of 4 or more acres together with their cottages. So we have two different groups of free peasant proprietors. One's defined as having the land and then offers up their labor for some income, right, to a larger landholder, say the baron or duke or whatever, right? And the other is primarily a laborer, but is also given 4 acres of land. So they're both doing the same things, right? Working for a certain wage for part of the time and growing their own food. Think about how healthy and organic all that food was at that point. Mostly vegetables, so people were pretty healthy. Continuing on. Besides, they, with the rest of the peasants, enjoyed an usufruct of the common land, which gave pasture to their cattle, furnished them with timber, firewood, turf, etc. Right? So the commons, such an important thing, because the commons is ultimately stolen by the emerging bourgeoisie as well, right? To be used, a lot of it in England, they just chopped down the woods so people couldn't gather firewood for free anymore, and put sheep there so they could make extra wool to send to America to be turned into clothes and then sent back to be bought and sold. Okay, continue on. In all countries of Europe, feudal production is characterized by division of the soil amongst the greatest possible number of subfeudatories. Notice how different that is. We have people who have no way to make money today, right? And no land, practically, right? And actually, some people have lots of homeless people today. Well, in this late feudal system, we have the greatest possible number of subfeudatories. That's because whoever's the leader, the baron, the duke, their capital was based on how many people, how many families were under them. Continuing on, the might of the feudal lord, like that of the sovereign, depended not on the length of his rent roll, but on the number of his subjects, and the later depended on the number of peasant proprietors. Although, therefore, the English land, after the Norman conquest, was distributed in gigantic baronies, one of which included some 900 of the old Anglo-Saxon lordships, it was bestrewn with small peasant properties, only here and there interspersed with great seigneurial domains. Such conditions, together with their prosperity of the towns, so characteristic of the 15th century, allowed of that wealth of the people which Chancellor Fortescue so eloquently paints in his Laude Legum Angliae, but it excluded the possibility of capitalistic wealth. Right? There's no capitalistic wealth. Because for all practical purposes, a baron didn't own the land. They were head of something like a family, right? That's how the feudal system saw itself. And so his children, adult men and women, families, these peasant proprietors, there's no possibility for capitalistic wealth. So you cannot accumulate that much wealth. You cannot be Bill Gates or Donald Trump or Elon Musk under a pre-capitalistic system. You just can't sit on that big of a hoard. It doesn't exist. The prelude of the revolution that laid the foundation of the capitalist mode of production was played in the last third of the 15th century and the first decade of the 16th century. A mass of free proletarians was hurled on the labor market by the breaking up of the bands of feudal retainers, who, as Sir James Stewart well says, everywhere uselessly filled house and castle. Although the royal power itself, a product of bourgeois development, in its strife after absolute sovereignty, forcibly hastened on the dissolution of these bands of retainers, it was by no means the sole cause of it. In insolent conflict with king and parliament, the great feudal lords created an incomparably larger proletariat by the forcible driving of the peasantry from the land, to which the later had the same feudal right as a lord himself, and by the usurpation of the common lands. The rapid rise of the Flemish wool manufacturers and the corresponding rise of the price of wool in England gave the direct impulse to those evictions. The old nobility had been devoured by the great feudal wars. The new nobility was the child of its time, for which money was the power of all powers. Transformation of arable land into sheep walks was, therefore, its cry. Harrison, in his description of England prefixed to Holinshed's Chronicle, describes how the expropriation of small peasants is ruining the country. What care our great encroachers? The dwellings of the peasants and the cottages of the laborers were razed to the ground or doomed to decay. If, says Harrison, the old records of Uri Manor be sought, it will soon appear that in some manner 17, 18, or 20 houses are shrunk, that England was never less furnished with people than at the present, of cities and towns either utterly decayed or more than a quarter or half diminished, though some one be a little increased here or there. of towns pulled down for sheep walks, and no more but the lordships now standing in them. I could say somewhat. The complaints of these old chroniclers were always exaggerated, but they reflect faithfully the impression made on the contemporaries by the Revolution in the conditions of production. A comparison of the writings of Chancellor Fortescue and Thomas More reveal the gulf between the 15th and 16th century. As Thornton rightly has it, the English working class was precipitated without any transition from its golden into its iron age. We'll continue there. We're up to page 790. So we have peasants, so we're talking my people, all the years too, being removed from the land which they had always inhabited, right? As serfs and then as peasant proprietors. And the movement from serfdom to peasant proprietordom was one of greater wealth, greater ownership, greater buy-in. But the revolution into capitalism was not. It was a stealing of land to turn it into larger owners' property, right? Commons disappeared. So this is our ancestors, our transition from being peasants to being made into proletarians with no buy-in to society except to try to become capitalists ourselves. I don't know, one can read this as Marx does and see some future idealistic communism, or one can read it with a more clear historical eye and say, well, we lived like that at one point. We could probably bring some aspects of that back into society. Maybe it'd take some type of political movement. Maybe it could be done transitionally. Maybe it could be done as a revolution. I don't know. But definitely, these are some of the important parts of Marx, and I'm going to continue with them in this playlist here on Marx. And my reflections as just a music teacher, somebody whose ancestors were peasants in Poland and Lithuania before those were even nations in the sense that they are today. But when they existed as peoples, and the peoples were pushed to the Americas or into the cities in Europe. And it happened eventually in the Americas where they pushed the people off the land there. And in Africa where they stole the people and sold them into slavery. And in Asia, all in different ways. But this is the history of our people. Have a blessed day.